Good morning. Thank you very much, Jane, and thank you for inviting me to be here with you today. It is a real privilege to be here. As Jane has said, I spent 5 years working here with the Policing Board, and that was so instructive and insightful in terms of how accountability can be done in a way that works for everybody. And in the course of our work for 5 years, Jane and I saw many, many policing operations up front in real time, and therefore got to really understand how decisions have to be made in very difficult circumstances very quickly. So it is a real privilege to be here. As Jane said, I'm now Shadow Secretary of State for exiting the EU. Whenever you enter any job or profession, you sort of daydream about what you might one day do. I have to say, Shadow Secretary of State for exiting the EU as a sort of passionate Remainer was not on my list of sort of dream jobs. But it's proving very interesting. I'm here all day today and tomorrow down in Dublin pursuing that. We're talking in this session about models of police accountability. And I just wanted to set the context by looking at what's happened in the 15 years that we're reflecting on and refocusing in relation to. Clearly, there's been a lot of change here, and I think it's very positive change, and we'll get into the detail of that in just a minute. There has, of course, been change elsewhere. So in England and Wales, in the last 15 years, we've swept away the police authorities that were there for many years. Police authorities with local councillors and independent members are completely gone, and in have come police and crime commissioners. So we in England and Wales have swapped our model of police accountability in that material way. That change took effect in 2012, and we had our second set of elections for PCCs this year. And it's still a little bit too early to say whether that model is better or worse than what we had before. My own sense is that where we've got good PCCs working constructively with the police, there's real value added. But it so depends on the individual doing the job. And I'm conscious, of course, that in the session we're about to have, I've got not only the Chief Constable of West Midlands, but the PCC of West Midlands. But it is interesting to see how that change has taken place. We have a slightly different model in London, and will have a different model in Manchester. So things in England and Wales are on the move. In London, the mayor has the main accountability role for policing and appoints traditionally a deputy mayor and a committee that does the oversight. So that's actually a little bit closer in many respects to what's happening here. And Manchester, as you may know, are about to elect their first mayor next year. And that's interesting because in addition to the usual mayoral duties, there is going to be duties in relation to health and policing. So Manchester is going to follow the London model of having a mayor as the primary accountability source. So lots has been on the change over in England and Wales, and it's quite useful to remember that as we discuss models of accountability this morning. So far as Northern Ireland is concerned, I'm acutely aware that there are many people in this room who know the accountability model far better than I do. I saw it in my work for the board for 5 years. And I was just struck, I think, by 3 things that I wanted to mention at this stage. The first is the tone of accountability. And I think this was set by pattern, actually, in terms of what it was that we were all trying to achieve. Calling the police service a police service, I think was really important. I think all police forces should be called police services. Because once you describe something as a service, you then ask different questions about what it is that's being provided as a service to the communities, rather than the police force, which has very different connotations. The board set its own tone very early. There were some very big challenges to the board in the very early days. Omar was one of the very big challenges, or the investigation of Omar. And so the tone of the board was really important. And so was the framework. Jane and I were lucky that the framework for monitoring human rights was very clearly set out in legislation. And so there was clarity about what needed to be done and what needed to be monitored. So the tone and the framework, I think, were really good so far as Northern Ireland is concerned. but also, I think, the makeup of the board and the role of the board. The board is diverse in the sense that there are different voices there from different parts of different communities. And this is really important. And this is, I think, where there's a contrast with the PCCs and a real debate to be had, whether you can have in one person the equivalent of what you got in a board. But what that brought home to me was the role of the board, in one sense, looking upwards and asking questions of the Chief Constable, constantly asking questions and demanding answers, which is really, really important when you're talking about confidence in policing. That level of scrutiny and accountability really matters because communities know when questions need to be asked and they know when they're getting an answer to those questions. But there was also something more subtle, and that was confidence coming back down through that structure, where board members and those involved in the accountability were able to assure communities about what was going on by reason of their role and the answers that they were getting to their questions. So it was very much a two-way process, and I think that was being incredibly important for accountability here and elsewhere where there's similar models. But I just want to end by coming to the question of culture, which is always overused as a term, but I just want to describe it from my own experience, because I was here from 2002 to 2007 on behalf of the board asking questions about human rights compliance. In 2008, I became the Director of Public Prosecutions. I inherited 9,000 staff, and I inherited nearly 1 million cases for which I was accountable every year. And I turned from being the person asking the questions, the person who was supposed to answer the questions from within an institution, within an organisation. And that was a really interesting experience, because then I really began to understand how the culture of an organisation plays into accountability. And I started asking myself of my own organisation, are we reluctantly doing the minimum to comply with accountability, or are we willingly doing the maximum? And that's a big cultural difference. The organisation itself, there's obviously the role of those who are doing the scrutiny, how good they are, how demanding they are, but there's also what's the culture of the institution? Does it want to do the most it possibly can to get the answers out there, to make sure what's being done is properly understood, and to account for the mistakes? There will always be mistakes. I had about 1 million cases a year going on in the CPS, 9,000 staff, let's say half a dozen key decisions on every case. That's millions of decisions. A percentage of them were always going to be wrong. That is inevitable in any organisation. And how you deal with that becomes really important. And my first test of what sort of an organisation I was running was 6 weeks in as DPP, when a file came across my desk, the Dan James file in relation to assisted suicide. This was a terrible, terrible case of a young man in his early 20s who was a brilliant rugby player, on the verge of getting into the national side, and absolutely committed to rugby. And then in training one day, the scrum collapsed on him, causing him awful injuries, paralysed completely from the neck down, unable to do anything. He was 6 months at Stoke Mandeville, unable to do anything at all, and never likely to get better. And this is not the place to go through the details of that case, but gradually he lost hope, he lost patience, and he decided he wanted to take his own life. And he decided, because of his state, that the only way he could do that, other than starving himself, was to go to Dignitas and take advantage of the clinic in Switzerland where suicide and assisted suicide is lawful. And his mother did not want him to do this. Absolutely did not want him to do this. But in the end, when he pleaded with her that he did not want to go on his own, he couldn't go on his own, and he didn't want to die on his own, she went with him, reluctantly and tragically and sadly. When she got back, she was arrested for the offence of assisted suicide. And the file came on my desk to decide whether or not she should be prosecuted for that offence. And having read the file, I took the decision that we should not be prosecuting her. And that's when the accountability and the culture kicked in, because I said to my team, I think we should explain this. we should fully explain why we've taken this decision. It's really important that people understand. And the organisation thought the explanation should be minimal, reluctant minimal. They said, well, the test for prosecution is there enough evidence to provide a realistic likelihood of a conviction, and is it in the public interest? So you can just put out a short statement indicating whether there was enough evidence and indicating whether it's in the public interest. And I said, no, we're going to put out a 10-page statement. I'm going to walk the public through the detail and the decisions so that they can see why we've arrived at this decision. And we did that. And it's the first time the Crown Prosecution Service had actually put out a long reasoned document explaining why a difficult decision had been taken in the way that it was. And people, although they either agreed or disagreed with the decision on assisted suicide whilst I was DPP, had confidence in the decision because they could see why we'd made the decision we had. It led, in that case, to a court then saying, well, if you can set out your reasons in that way, you can also have a policy setting out how you're going to approach those kinds of cases. And again, the reaction initially of the Crown Prosecution Service is, we don't want this. But actually, once we'd had guidelines in place and had reasons, it became a lot easier to see the decision-making, and we were more accountable, because what we'd done is set out in advance for everybody to see how we would approach certain problems, and then explained afterwards why we'd taken the decision that we had, and people could see whether we had complied with our own guidance in a way they'd never been able to before. But it was a struggle to get the organisation to move from a sort of traditional role of, well, we'll do what we have to, but let's keep it minimal, to let's push the boundaries and put that information out there. And the final bit of culture, and then I'll finish, is this. And it goes back to what I said about mistakes. There will be mistakes in any organisation. The question is how you deal with them. One thing that we introduced when I was DPP in the Crown Prosecution Service was a voluntary right of review. So anybody who has a decision taken, who's a victim, who has a decision taken that a case is not started, or if started is dropped, has an automatic right of review without having to put forward any reasons. And the review, and this is the interesting thing, I wanted the review to be carried out in the first instance by the team that took the decision. It then went to a different team. But I wanted the teams to understand that looking again at their own decision and possibly changing it was not a failing. It was actually a good thing. And through that scheme, we managed to build confidence in decision-making. So models of accountability really matter. There are the PCC model is one model. The broader, more diverse board model is a different model. And I think there are strengths and weaknesses that would be really useful to tease out. But in the end, what also matters is the culture of the organisation that is subject to the scrutiny. And the question is, are we pushing the barriers and doing more than we're required to do? Or are we just doing the minimum so we can tick the box of accountability, but not really change the culture of the organisation? I think I found in my 5 years as DPP that was the most important question. Thank you very much, Jane.